All right, we're now moving into prisoners of war and enemy soldiers who get captured. And here, the triage principle, and you can think of it as an enemy soldier coming in at the same time as one's own soldier. The triage principle says treat those two equally. Now, there are some military care providers who, for very understandable emotional reasons, have some pain at that, particularly when the enemy soldier being brought in for treatment is one they know has killed their own soldiers, and sometimes they even know the very soldiers that they've killed. Hard emotionally then to give them equal treatment, particularly if they have limited resources and know that one price of treating the enemy soldier is that a U.S. soldier less severely injured may not get treatment. So that's a first problem. Well, how might one look at that situation? One might see the enemy soldier as, at the time he or she becomes a prisoner, as no longer primarily a soldier, because he or she no longer has weapons, isn't at least anywhere near the same degree of threat. So maybe at that time, that enemy soldier is what persons might call a non-combatant, or in ethical terms, primarily a fellow human being. There was a chief of surgery here at USIS named David Burris, who unfortunately died not too long ago, and he used to talk about when he would serve overseas and do surgery, when he would be doing surgery and during the surgery hold the enemy soldier's heart in his hand in the soldier's chest during surgery. He had a very compelling awareness that he was treating another human being, not an enemy soldier. So that might be a first ethical rationale for treating the soldier, the enemy prisoner, equally to one soldier. There are other rationales. Yes, if the U.S. treats enemy soldiers equally, they might model for the rest of the world the highest ethical standard. Something to be said for that. And it's plausible, whether or not likely, that if we treat an enemy soldier equally, another country might treat our soldiers equally as well. So there are some rationales for that. Now, we also are required legally, under the Geneva Convention, to treat enemy soldiers equally. Interestingly, the U.S. has not agreed to treat civilians who are injured equal to our own and enemy soldiers. Why? Well, the reason was the U.S. was actually trying to be honest and to show integrity in not agreeing to that. The U.S.'s rationale was, gee, if we agree to that, we would, during every exchange, have to have massive resources to be able to treat everybody equally. We aren't sure we can live up to that promise. Well, notwithstanding that, medical care providers try to do all they can, when they can, for civilians. There are indeed some specific groups of civilians who military care providers are required to treat, but sometimes they will try to go as far as they can beyond that. My favorite example that someone returning from the Middle East told me about was a time they found a way to fly by helicopter a pregnant woman to a military medical facility to get the care that she needed. Quite admirable. Well, returning to prisoners of war, yes, there's a technical issue legally, and by technical, I don't mean to bias how you see this, but there's some question of who counts under the law, under the Geneva Convention, as being a prisoner of war. Military and medical people, by and large, don't make that distinction. When the enemy soldier comes to them, whether he or she is technically a prisoner of war or not, to whom the Geneva Convention would apply, isn't something they worry about a great deal nor have time to worry about. They treat. We've talked about civilians, and indeed, if there's a shortage of resources and the law says treat your own troops and prisoners first before civilians, that can cause and does cause much angst for military care providers. They try to do the best they can. Well, there are ways that one could theoretically game the system. That is, one could literally treat prisoners equally and still treat one's soldiers first if one decided to categorize one's own soldiers and enemy prisoners in a large enough group, like all those at risk of dying. Then they could perhaps treat all their soldiers within that group first, because the Geneva Convention doesn't say when prisoners and your own soldiers are equal that you have to choose randomly whom you treat, treating, for example, one's own soldier and then a prisoner and one's own prisoner. And similarly, the Geneva Convention says nothing about when you should stop treatment and go for the mission, as happened in the example we looked at during World War II when penicillin first came around. So there are various scenes that one could come up with, such as making a large category of all those who had equal injuries, prisoners and enemy soldiers alike, and one started treating one's own soldiers first, but was still, in a literal sense, treating them equally to the enemy prisoners, and then somewhere along the way decided to put one's resources into the mission. Well, that you can think about. There are theoretical issues that are interesting, but perhaps not of practical use. Now we're ready to look at some of the issues that have arisen after 9/11, and we're going to focus a bit on interrogations. Well, the classic issue that comes up here is, what about the enemy prisoner who has information of a bomb that's going to go off blowing up New York City? Would it be justifiable to use harsh techniques, using that euphemism, to interrogate that prisoner so that he or she will cough up the information that will save millions of people in New York City? There's two problems that those looking at that situation raise. First, would it ever occur? Second, would those doing the interrogations be certain that the person they're going to interrogate really has that information? And finally, if they use harsh means of interrogation, will the information be dependable? Or will the soldier say whatever he or she thinks will stop the interrogation? There's a huge debate that we won't go into of what good, if any, interrogation does. Most people who have looked at that situation say most of the time it doesn't produce important information. And there are others who say, well, there's this time and that time that it does and has. So we're back to the question of who should decide and how. Note that there's a whole spectrum of interventions that one can address here. We've talked about harsh interrogation methods on one hand. Some say that military care providers and even guards at a prison should not go so far as to become friends with prisoners as a means of getting information that can help the military. Some say even that would be using enemy prisoners as a means to the military's ends, and because of the Kantian principle we looked at earlier, they say that that would be impermissible. So much for the general context. Specifically, there is a range of interventions which have been used, ranging from sleep deprivation in some contexts on one hand to waterboarding on the other. Many people think that that's the continued concern in regard to interrogations. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe we've seen no more of those sort of interventions and those sort of questions. Well, a question that continues is, regardless of what those limits are on what is now permissible in interrogations, there's the question of whether military care providers should or should not be at all involved. Many organizations say military care providers should not be involved at all, even as consultants. On the other hand, there's a strong view that by having care providers involved, they're likely to help as consultants to actually help prisoners by being aware of some, perhaps, interrogators' behaviors which might be unnecessarily traumatic. And therefore, military care providers might be able to help prisoners by limiting inadvertent, overly strong or harsh interrogations, and might even be able to help the interrogators to keep whatever they do within limits which we all can come closer to respect or fully respect. Now, we're back to the problem we began with, of who should make these determinations and how. And I'm going to jump a bit to another situation, namely to Guantanamo, to the prison there, where a number of prisoners have, of course, come and remained in prison there in Cuba. Well, the question I'd like to highlight is the one, who should be released? Now, the notion may be that of, let us say, 100 prisoners, though it has been at sometimes much more than that there may be, after inquiry, good grounds for releasing some of those prisoners. At the same time, it may be known in advance, theoretically, statistically, that a small percentage of that group may rejoin the enemy forces to fight against us. How is that known? Some prisoners who have been released, have fought against us, been killed, and then it's been found out that they are the same persons who were in the prison in Cuba. Well, that raises a number of questions. One is, okay, what risks or what hit should our troops be willing to take for the gain of freedom, if you will, of being released if you're a prisoner? That's a decision where one could say, okay, is 10% risk about right, 1%, or should it be even higher? And again, we have the situation where we must ask, who should decide? Those with the knowledge, or to a greater extent, the greater society? Well, one of the specific questions that's come up at Guantanamo has had to do with forced feeding. That is to say, there have been some prisoners there who've said they aren't going to eat and are going to starve and, in fact, die. Worth your being aware of some of the competing rationales in regard to this question. One rationale for force feeding those prisoners is the importance of the sanctity of their life, and that is for those taking care of them not having any part in allowing them to die. Well, if that's the main rationale, one can ask the following question. If you're saving a prisoner's life against, here what would be his will, because all the prisoners there are men, I think still, what quality of life do they have if they're going to live on their entire life there? Is it a life they'd want to continue to stay alive at? And does that matter? For example, what if they have no contact whatsoever with their family? Might they have their life more worth living if they were to be able to somehow have, through letters, however, some sort of contact? I'm raising that to simply exemplify the fact that if you're going to impose sanctity of life over and against prisoners' autonomy, might there be some other gains, such as contact with their family, that should go with that if they can be brought about? The sort of question that all might ask, and particularly military care providers, you all, as you're thinking about this question.